Hello everyone! Thank you for joining us and welcome back to FFG Live. My name is Brooke Robison and I am joined today by John Shaffer, our very special guest. And today we are going to be revisiting the subtle art of painting miniatures for Star Wars Legion and building on our past live stream where John and Evan painted Luke Skywalker to get into more detail and really look at how you can take your minis to the next level. So today we are going to be looking at specifically weathering and bases. John, what figures are we going to be painting today?
So I'm going to go and illustrate these techniques across a number of different miniatures as we go, but to kind of show you an example of what we have and what we're kind of shooting towards, as you see here in the middle of the table, you can see that we've got a number of different figures here that have some kind of scenic bases that are kind of elevated and brought up a little bit, and then they have like a number of different little elements like scenic basing elements like stones and twigs and little grass tufts, things like that, that are then added in there that kind of really add a lot more to the visual appeal of the miniatures. So the way that I achieve that is I use I get first a base, and then I take that base and I add a 2-part epoxy putty over top of it. So it's something that self-hardens. So you're going to mix it in equal parts. It's very similar to green stuff, but I prefer this particular material because it's a little bit more water soluble. So you're going to apply that over top of the base. Then you're just going to jam a bunch of stuff in there and then smooth it all out. And then when you're done with that, you'll go back in, you'll texture it, and then add more sand over top of it and then paint it as you would a normal base, picking out all the details as you go. So there's some kind of cool tricks that you can do along the way as well, kind of seen here on this ATST base, where you can apply some of this putty first and then push the foot or tracks of, if you're working on a tank or anything in particular, down into the material to leave footprints, which is kind of cool when you go back through and really kind of want to paint a bit of a scene. So this is kind of where my ATST 1 foot is going to fit, but he's got a bit of an indentation here of another footprint back behind it, which I'm going to add a little bit of water effects and stuff to later. But this is just kind of showing you another example of how these scenic bases can kind of turn out as you go through the overall process. So to start off with, you want to take a standard base here. So we've got a speeder bike base, this guy right here. And you have these arcs on here that you want to maintain and keep a good eye on where those are located. So what I typically like to do with that is I'll take a little bit of paint and I'm just going to mark out where those lines are, just so I can refer back to them a little bit later by extending them down off the side of the base a little bit, just so I know where my vision arcs are in case my putty kind of obscures what I'm working on. So we got a little bit of brown here, just making some light little marks here. And we will also go back in and we'll kind of like cut out a little bit of indentations on the edges of these to make sure you can still see those vision arcs. Like a good example here, you can see on this guy, let me pop this guy off the base here. You can see that I still have left these little small marks here on either side, on all 4 quadrants here, to make sure that I can still see those arcs because it's pretty important for gameplay.
So just as we're getting started here, what kind of equipment would you need in order to do this at home?
So you're going to want a sculpting tool of any sort. So that can be, as simple as one of these kind of dental tools here. They sell a wide variety of different types, but anything that's kind of comfortable for you to use to kind of mush and push that epoxy around a little bit is going to be very helpful. If you really want to go a little bit further, you can use silicone tipped sculpting tools, which give you like a nice soft surface for smoothing out some details, but that's usually best reserved for green stuff work, which I can go into probably in a future stream.
So a dental tool.
A dental tool, yeah. It's mostly like these are actually specifically designed for sculpting on miniatures in particular, but they are very, very similar to a lot of two-ended dental tools that you'll often see. So usually the important part is that you have like a large kind of flat surface here, like a kind of a spade bit, and then have like a bit of a point on the other end over on this side. So it doesn't have to be like super, well, exactly like this one in particular. You're going to find different materials that you're going to like. But this is kind of the standard that you will find if you just go to any sort of hobby store and look for a sculpting tool.
Okay.
Cool. So the first thing I want to do is that with this epoxy in particular, it has a tendency to kind of dry and harden, and unless you add a little bit of texture and tooth to the base, it will at times pop off of the base after it is dried. So that's not really something you want. So in order to kind of mitigate that, I'm going to be real careful. I'm just going to do like a little crosshatched pattern over top of the base with my hobby knife here.
You're off camera, John.
Oh, here we go. There we go. You can see it here, just kind of like going around the base, minding my fingers, don't want to chop off any fingertips, that would be very bad. And then just kind of cross hatch it a little bit in each direction. And this is just going to add a little bit more surface area for that epoxy to grab onto, and a little bit more texture, some grooves.
A little off camera, John.
Also, just a note for anyone tuning in, if you have any specific questions for John, feel free to throw them in the chat and we'll try to cover them. And if you would like to see more of like an introductory video for like getting started painting your minis, you can check out our FFG live channel on YouTube and check out our previous live stream for Legion painting with you and Evan.
Yeah, totally. We painted a Luke Skywalker. We kind of covered the basics of base coating and washes. If you're already familiar with all that sort of stuff, this is going to go a little bit further beyond that. And you know, we're just going to touch on a number of different things that I often get asked about as far as my own miniatures and how I go about them. So anyway, so we've gotten this all pretty much cross-hatched and nice and textured. So now we've got these two parts here. So you've got a part A and a part B, and they're labeled usually by the tops of the caps. And it comes in a number of different colors, but I just kind of buy the cheap stuff, which is usually just the natural color, which is kind of like this off gray. So we mix these things together. We get about two sized bits that are about roughly the same size here, you can see here. Mash those fellows together, mash them nice and flat, and then I like to roll them up just to make sure that I get lots of contact between the two different parts. So kind of keep mashing this all together. And this will probably take about an hour or an hour and a half to dry to a point where it is rigid enough that it will not leave a mark if you put your sculpting tool to it. But you really want to let it kind of sit over dry overnight before you jump back into it and work with it too much. So yeah, so we're going to mash all this stuff out like this, and then I'm just going to take little bits of it and kind of start to create some little raised areas here on the base where we can put some stuff. And note that I have already glued down the base peg here, the clear peg. You're going to want to make sure, if you want to keep that peg nice and clear, you have a couple of different options. You could leave it separate and then just mash it down after you put a bit of that on there. In which you're going to like push it down and then you can glue it on later. I kind of like to build it up around the sides of it so you get this kind of nice kind of effect where it just goes straight from the base into the clear peg over top. But if you do that, make sure that you wrap up the clear peg with some masking tape before you prime it, because otherwise you're just going to paint over it. Mm-hmm. And I like to leave that masking tape on the entire time that I'm going through and painting the base. So I'm just kind of mash this stuff around to different places, and I'm going to leave a little bit around, like I don't want to go all the way to the edge of where those vision arc lines are. I want to kind of leave those largely revealed so I don't obscure them. So I'm going to push all this stuff around a little bit.
And is there any way to speed up the drying process, or do you really just have to?
This stuff in particular, I don't know. I've heard some people have put it in an oven, but I don't know. Like I'm kind of hesitant to do that because I'm sure I would just be absent-minded and go and get some lunch and just leave it in my oven and it would just burn up. So, but yeah, I think usually if you just kind of let them sit, I typically will do this process over the a course of like 5 or 6 bases all at one time. So as I'm working through it, by the time I get to the very end one, the first one is getting closer to drying. So as I go about and do it. So I'm just going to kind of add a little bit of texture in here by just kind of mashing this down across it. And then just to make it a little bit more regular so it just isn't quite just like the huge mound that it is. The thing that I really like about this particular putty is that it is water soluble like clay. So you can, unlike green stuff, you can just kind of form a slip with it and really mash it in and make it really smooth. It's great for gap filling on miniatures as well. Super, super useful. Cool. So next step is I've got a bunch of stuff in this little tray here. A bunch of different slate pieces, some little bits of twigs and other things that I found out in my yard. I've kind of gathered all these little bits up together. So I'm going to just kind of take these and start to just jam them into this putty. And I want to push down and then I want to push back a little bit towards the center of the base. And that's going to create a little bit of a lip up along the top, and it's going to leave a little bit of a recess down underneath it. And that's going to help kind of create a different kind of stepping effect, I think, as you go through. So again, just kind of It's kind of arbitrary really how you do it. I typically like to have like odd numbers of things, of elements on here, because I think it looks a little bit more visually appealing and is a little bit less symmetrical.
Keep a little off camera, John.
Yep. So we've got here these 3 little bits, and I think for a little variety I'm going to add a little twig in here. I'm going to try to find this one that's like kind of cool and jagged like that. So we're going to put this guy up and over top of that. So I'm going to anchor this guy down here. You can like hang there a little bit and mash this guy down. I'm going to break off the excess. Okay, so now we've got all this stuff kind of secured in there. I can take my sculpting tool and I can kind of pull down and around all these things to kind of even it out and make it look a little bit more natural. Cool. Kind of flatten this out a little bit. I like doing these live streams because I get some work done on my own stuff on the clock. It's kind of great. I'm working on my 3rd unit of speeder bikes right now because I'm convinced they are awesome. All right, so we've kind of gone through and like smoothed all this stuff out, so we've not got a pretty good representation of the final look. Make sure that keep any of the epoxy out of this little channel here because you're going to need that for your movement tool later on. So pull any of that stuff out of there as you go. Cool, that looks pretty good to me. Awesome. So at that point, I would just let this guy dry for a while and let him sit, but I kind of prepared one ahead of time right here, which is all kind of set up. Very similar. You can kind of see that I went back in with my sculpting tool and I just made sure that if I was obscuring any of those little arc lines that I went through and I kind of pushed them back in and made a little indentation for them so that they are still revealed. And you can still see where those arcs are. All right, got that guy? Cool, so that guy's pretty much good. So at this point I've got a little bit of wood glue, which is what I typically like to use to adhere my material to the base. So I just put a little bit of wood glue in this little dropper bottle here. I'm gonna take a little bit of that out. And take kind of a not very great brush. We'll use this guy right here. And then you're just gonna go through, and I like to start up here near the peg and just paint in a little bit of this wood glue. Be careful to kind of dodge around the rocks and the other items that are down along the base. I don't really dilute this wood glue very much. I keep it pretty thick, enough so you can spread it pretty easily. But it's more important that it has a good amount of tack to it. So I usually don't thin it down too much with water because I really want to make sure that any of the sand that I apply later is going to adhere well.
So if something did break off later, is there an easy way to repair a base?
Yeah, I think you can just go back the same way that you kind of created it. You'll just go back in and add a little bit of wood glue, glue down the sand over top of it, repaint that little patch, and then go back in and dry brush it back up and kind of and pick out all the details as you go. So I'm just going to work around this base right quick. Get all this glue on here. And I like to do about half of it because the glue will, because I'm not thinning it down very much, it's going to dry pretty quickly. So I don't really want to like do the whole base and then have part of it dry, and then when I go to add my sand, it's all not sticking anymore. So that's about enough for me right now. So I just have a little shallow bin here with some sand. And I would suggest to resist the urge of just dipping it in there and just pushing it because it's going to create these kind of like berms in it. So I think that you usually get better results if you just kind of sprinkle it from up above over top of it. And let it kind of pile it up a little bit and then use your thumb to kind of push it down slightly just to make sure that it's going to hold on there pretty well. Light pressure as you go.
So we actually have a question from the Twitch chat. So when basing, if you use twigs or found organic items, do you have to treat them to keep them from decay/bugs?
Yeah, you do. I will coat them with a layer of the same wood glue when I'm done. But I usually will do that either early on in the process before I've actually applied the sand or after the fact, just as I kind of paint over top of it. But yeah, it's definitely a very good idea to add a little bit of that just for the longevity of your miniature. Otherwise, after a while, they'll become very dry and kind of brittle, and they can break off very easily. So Yeah, soak them in some wood glue. If you're really, really worried about it, you could certainly make a mixture of wood glue and water and soak the stuff in it overnight. And then, soak it in there overnight, take it out, let it sit for about another day or so, and then you just have a bunch of stuff that's all pretty diesel and fortified with glue.
John, you gotta bring your hands down, you're out of focus.
Okay, right about here.
Yep.
Cool,
Thank you.
no problem. All right, so round on the other outside here. And be careful when you're going up against like another bit of glue that or area that already has sand on it. You don't want to layer up more glue on top of it because it's going to start to heap more sand on top and you're going to really see the division between it. So you want to kind of go right up to the very edge of it if you can. Be kind of careful as you go. And if you get a little bit too much, don't be afraid to use your finger and just kind of brush a little bit of it off and then tidy it back up.
So do you have any advice for people who think they don't have the chops to undertake something like this?
Sure. I think you take it slow. I think don't set your sights too high. I think that we are often like very judgmental of our efforts because there are so many great people out there that do awesome tutorials that kind of set the standard of like this is what you have to do to enjoy this hobby, and it's certainly not the case. I think you take it as far as you want to. People that are really good at this have been doing it for years and years and years, and it's just like any sort of skill. You just kind of develop your own personal preferences and your own techniques as you go, and over time you just get better and better at it. So I think just be patient, just enjoy the ride because it's you're learning a new skill, you're developing like a sensitivity to materials and techniques that you probably didn't have before, and I think it's pretty rewarding just to like enjoy the process as opposed to get too fixated on the results. All right, cool. So that guy is now textured right there. If we really wanted to, we could water down a lot of wood glue and paint over top of this to add another layer that's really going to cement all that material down. But I likely put on a pretty heavy coat of paint over top of it. And I find that if you water down too much wood glue, it starts to seep in and fill out some of the recesses and you lose a little bit of texture in the end. So I typically like to just kind of put a layer of paint over top of this and then just go through it and start to dry brush it and bring it up after that. Cool. So that covers the first little bit that I wanted to talk about, which was scenic basing. It's really pretty straightforward. This approach can be applied to a myriad of different miniatures. You can also do some kind of fun stuff like with this shore trooper, for example, in which I kind of only really put the texture on one portion of it and then kind of left a little bit of the shoreline showing there underneath it. Just add a little bit of variation to the bases. If you're doing an entire army like that, it might look a little samey, so I think it's kind of a nice technique to just use sparingly on characters or guys that you like in particular. So I really like this shore trooper unit leader, so I decided to do something fun with the base.
And it really helps build out like every individual soldier's personality a little bit.
Yeah, that's something I really like. I think you'll probably notice that like a lot of these miniatures here in the center of the table have like some modifications to them. I kind of went through and I added a green stuff cloak to this fellow here, the speeder bike guy. You can see there, which I think looks pretty cool, flying in the breeze. I kind of did the same for my unit leaders of my strike teams as well. And then even just like changing some poses of some guys, like that stormtrooper unit leader, just by adjusting his arms and how they're set up, kind of adds like a little bit of variety of miniatures. And I think maybe at a later date I'll go into more detail about customizing your figures as you go through. Cool. Last little example, I got a Veers here that I particularly like. That's got some snowtrooper arms and a snowtrooper backpack on him that kind of makes him fit in with some other modified miniatures that I have at home. Anyway, cool. So moving on. So we're going to talk next about vehicle weathering in particular. So I've got an ATRT here. This is kind of the end effect that we're kind of shooting for. It has some nice kind of rusty undertones underneath it, some kind of high contrast, some little paint chipping on the edges of things, and it looks suitably worn and beat up. So the place that I start with that is I will start with a base coat of a nice rusty red primer, kind of like we see on this ATSD here. So it's nice and kind of almost a little bit more than terracotta, I guess. It's kind of a rusty orange. And you can usually get that in most home improvement stores. They have kind of like this flat red primer, I believe is what they call it. So I've gone through and I primed this this ATRT with that color first, and you can kind of see it down here in the crevices. And I made sure to get all of that red down in here into the most recessed parts, so it really kind of fills in those shadowed areas. And then over top of that, I took my primer can, which is just like a regular gray, and I did what's called a kind of zenithal technique, where it means light at its zenith, shining down from wherever it is. So all that essentially means is that you're taking this thing and you're spraying it from above, so it's only like really hitting the raised areas. And it's only really going to be effective if you do that with a lighter color than whatever the base coat is, or if a color that has a fair amount of contrast. Mm-hmm. So in this case, I chose a gray because I want this thing to be kind of gray at the end, and I've got some kind of rusty tones underneath it. So you can get this kind of effect. You can achieve it with regular rattle cans, just like spray cans, if you like. You're definitely going to get better results if you use an airbrush. It'll be a lot finer particles and a lot smoother gradation in between the two. But a lot of people aren't comfortable or don't have access to an airbrush, so spray cans will certainly work as well. So after I've gotten this kind of initial bit down here, what I like to do is just as a kind of a guiding step, I like to do a very light dry brush with a light gray, or a lighter color than whatever your Hull color is. So in this case, I've got a little bit of a Fleet Trooper gray here. I'm going to apply this to my palette. Oops. Oh, the top came off. Now I got lots of Fleet Trooper gray. It's going to be great. Mm-hmm. All right. Cool. So we'll
live streaming. There's nothing like
live streaming. Nothing like it. Lots and lots of paint. Now I'm going to have to paint a lot of stormtroopers probably with all this gray. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I'm going to take a lot of this stuff here. I'm going to kind of take the majority of the paint off of the brush here, so it's nice and sparse. And I often use a towel here, kind of like this, and I will use this to get a lot of it off as well. Mm-hmm. I'm going to kind of lightly dry brush over top of this guy by changing the direction. Really, really light pressure. All I really want this to do is just kind of give me a little bit of guidance on the edges, of that I'm trying to hit here, just really, really lightly. And we're going to tidy up a lot of these kind of like stray marks with some more careful painting later. But I find that this kind of helps just to get the initial contrast going of the colors.
Mm-hmm. So as we're moving into weathering, what are some of the main pitfalls from the weathering process, and how can you avoid those?
Main pitfalls. I think that you have to be careful to not overdo it. I think you have to be careful to make it look natural and irregular. And that is sometimes tricky because your natural tendency is to make things, oftentimes, is to make things very symmetrical or very kind of controlled, especially when you're dealing with a lot of very careful painting otherwise. So I think that you have to be very careful to randomize your marks and also just trying to get like a good level of contrast without kind of like muddying up a lot of the details with a lot of extra steps as you go through. Mm. So again, I got a really kind of ratty, long bristled brush. It's nice and soft, so it has a lot of give. And I have hardly any paint on this thing, so I'm really just kind of like through repetition picking out any sort of these raised areas as I go.
But the sound of like the brush on the miniature is just so relaxing.
I know, right? Yeah, it's just kind of like this light whisking. Mm-hmm. And I definitely enjoy just the act of dry brushing because it's like, it produces very dramatic effects. It kind of produces a bit of a chalky finish at times that you have to be kind of careful with. I think if, kind of a modified dry brush of like doing the initial bit and then kind of going back in with more careful painting over top to kind of tidy up the edges certainly helps out with the overall finish. Mm. But it is a very fast and very simple technique to get a lot of work done relatively quickly, and I think it certainly has its uses in just regular tabletop standard miniatures and also kind of display quality stuff too. You just have to be a little bit discerning in how you apply the technique. Okay, cool. So I've gone through and I've kind of dry brushed this fella here. You can kind of see that I have quite a bit more contrast up here on the very edges of these things. I can kind of see the edges in and around. So I think the next step that I want to do is I want to start to do kind of my favorite part, which is actually adding in a lot of the shadow on and a lot of the rusty bits over top of it. So I'm going to use a bit of strong tone here, which is nice and kind of coffee colored. And it's going to give me, it's nice and transparent. If you are not familiar with how washes and shades work, they're typically designed to be transparent enough that they don't necessarily obscure a lot of the color, and they're very thin, so they kind of rest down in the recesses as you go. So with this first little bit, I want to use this for like the most, kind of like the darkest, most recessed areas. So I'm just going to kind of go through and paint it where like these big, large forms kind of come together, like, and just kind of trace the shadow. And I've got a pretty fine brush here. It's pretty small and very detailed. And I'm going to kind of go around each one of these little bits. So after I get that initial little bit in there, I'm going to show you kind of like some of the basics of just like using a transparent blend. So I've got a little bit here in this crack. And what you want to do is then just go back in, take your brush, take a little bit of water off of it, and then just feather out that edge with a little bit of water to get a smoother transition. You might be able to see it a little bit easier here. I'm going to use a little bit more.
Heads up, John. So you're twisting into the shot and your hat is blocking about halfway.
Got it. All right, so in this case, same story here. I got a nice like fine little edge there. It's pretty stark, but I want to fade that out. So I'm just went back in, I got a little bit of water, and I'm just kind of brushing out the edge of that as I go. And you don't want to have so much water on there that it's going to get super thin and really runny. You want to kind of just have it be nice and damp as you go. So now you're starting to get kind of that more dithered effect. You can kind of see there with the sheen, you can see like the wetness of the paint and where it's actually being applied over top of it. I'm going to kind of add a little bit more of this feathering over top to kind of smooth out this gradation. Then as you work towards the edge, you're just adding a little bit more and more water to your brush. So if you are leery about the runniness of paint and the water by adding all this extra water to the paint itself, you can use acrylic medium, and that is essentially, it adds transparency to the paint without reducing the viscosity of it. So you still have a lot of control as you go through and apply it. And acrylic medium usually you can get from an art supply store. It's usually pretty thick. I'm gonna apply a little bit here in the center of my palette so you can see it. This little dollop right here. And you can thin down with quite a bit of water. This is kind of like artist grade stuff, so it's quite a bit thicker than some other stuff that you might get. So you're gonna have to add a little bit of water to it to thin it all out.
Heads up on your hat.
And then you can add a little bit of this. And you can see that it's nice and transparent as it was before, but it's not nearly as thin and honey as it might be otherwise. So I'm going to kind of use the same basic approach here over on this side. And I'm just going to take a little bit more medium as opposed to water. I'm going to use that to kind of feather things out. So you can also use this acrylic medium to create your own shades for the miniatures, which is pretty handy if you are looking for kind of like shadow colors that are not quite as dark and staining as like standard washes are, where it goes like straight to like a very dark brown. If you wanted it to like go down into like say this color in particular, you could mix up a bunch of this, a little bit of water and the medium together to kind of create some nice transparent effects. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to kind of apply the same sort of stage here, this kind of like thinned down version of this paint. Then again, I'm just going to use my brush here and kind of feather it out. Some people really like to use two brushes simultaneously, where they have like one for the feathering purpose and then one to like load up the paint. I think swapping back and forth between the two brushes is a little cumbersome at times, but it's a personal preference. However you want to go about it. So we're going to add a little bit more. And I think that, what really makes this technique look really cool is the gradation and like the subtle transition of these colors, and especially with these kind of like rusty tones. So I think that that's really a big part of what you want to leverage in this process, is that kind of gradation of these like kind of colors going through.
So another question from the Twitch chat.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can use this to make a glaze?
Yeah, definitely. That's probably one of the fundamental uses for it. So the difference between like a glaze and a wash is a glaze is intended to be a thin, transparent coat that is going to go over top of the raised areas and the shadowed areas, or the recessed areas, kind of in equal measure to kind of tint the overall color. It's like sunglasses. It's like a layer of thin, transparent color that's going over top of whatever it is to tint whatever is underneath it. So it's really useful technique to like build up and adjust in a kind of a gradual way. I really like to use it on monster skin, like anything that has like variations in color, you know, especially something that's kind of like decayed or like kind of, I don't know, like vampiric or like, I don't know, just you know, anything that would have like these kind of interesting and skin tones that might suggest like disease or age or anything like that. So
My car from Northman.
yeah, perfect. Yeah. White car, you could just certainly do it, or any of the like the spine threshers, any of those big demons, that sort of thing. It'd be good on the anything with like large flat areas of skin. I find it to be very. It can also just be a useful tool for just tinting and adjusting the colors that you have. If you want things to be a little bit lighter or darker, or if you want to add some shadow, you can kind of use those glazes to kind of shade in and do the more recessed parts. So we've kind of gone through and we've added a little bit of that rusty effect to that leg there. I'm going to kind of continue around this guy here. So what I really want to do with this kind of high contrast orange color is like chase the deepest channels, wherever those might fall. So there's one right here. Unfortunately, it's going to be largely obscured by the driver, but I still, just for the sake of illustrating the point, I'm just going to go through and do it. So you're going to go through and kind of like chase that recessed area there. Then I'm going to add a little bit of the medium to my brush, and I'm just going to kind of feather out the edge a little bit there too, to kind of get a nice transition. And it shows like kind of a nice defining line, I think, there. That looks pretty cool. Certainly like it. So after we've kind of gone through and added some of these kind of rusty effects, I like to then go back in and also apply some edge highlights, kind of following, and that's where that dry brush stage kind of came in earlier. It gives me a little bit of a guiding line to follow to kind of trace some of these edges. So when it comes to edge highlights in particular, I like to use the miniature as much as possible to define the surface contact of the brush to the miniature. So rather than going straight in on this guy and trying to like paint this edge, this upper highlight right here, I'm actually going to use the side of my brush, put it about halfway across it, and then the only point of contact is right along that top edge where you see it. So I can also kind of go through here and I can kind of trace this a little bit, you know, and I'm just kind of using like the very edge of my brush to kind of pick these little bits out. It's kind of functioning like that dry brush we did earlier, but it's much more controlled. It's a lot more careful and calculated as you go through and do it. So you'll also have, especially like these, like round bits right here, because it's really nice to illustrate that kind of zenithal look by highlighting the raised areas of the edges that are going to catch the light. So in this case, you've got this internal part, right here, which kind of connects there. And then you've got a line up here along the top. Then you want to paint a little bit in here like that. And then to further kind of emphasize this effect, I'm going to take a little bit of this kind of brown and gray, or brown and orange, I mean. And then I'm going to paint in on the bottom half of this thing a little line in here like this. So we've got a little bit of that overall effect there that's adding a little bit of a shadow, but I want that to be a little bit more gradual. So again, I'm kind of taking my brush, dipped in a little bit of water, brushed off the excess, and then I'm just going to feather out that edge a little bit to kind of get that transition in there that I really want. And if you go a little bit too far, don't be afraid. You can always go back in with the base coat color, whatever you have in there, and kind of tidy this stuff up. But at the end, that's kind of the effect that I'm looking for. It's like a nice contrast of like this darker shadow underneath it. I've got a highlight over top of here. I might go back in and tidy up that highlight a little bit to make it a little bit cleaner. And then over top of here, I got a nice highlight on the top part as well. So I think to kind of illustrate that, kind of going back in and tidying things up, let me see if I've got the gray that I need here. Durasteel, no, we'll use Sith robes. That sounds not menacing at all. So this is quite a bit of a darker gray, so I'm gonna have to mix up a little bit of this color. And then I can use that to kind of go back in and tidy up some of these edge highlights. Cool. So we'll kind of continue around the whole time. So the next little bit is sometimes you run into an area on the miniature where you have like a racing stripe or like something in particular that's going to kind of break up the overall whole color that you have. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm going to go ahead and I'll do green because that's typically the color that you see for the ATRTs. And I'm going to mix up a little bit of this stuff.
Running Sabine, and all bets are off.
Yeah, you can have all the colors if you're running Sabine. You can kind of choose your there. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go through here and I'm just going to paint the typical that you see on these ATRTs, which is there's a single line that goes across over here, and then it also kind of comes down to the. So I'll fill all that in pretty well. I think I want to go a little bit darker just so I can pick it up on camera a little bit better. So I'm going to go with a little darker green. I'm going to go with Green Squadron. Just got a little blue in it too, but that's cool. All right. We're just going to go right over top of this color that we already put down. We'll kind of mix it together a little bit. Okay, so we've got a kind of green pattern right there on the top. It's a little shiny right now because the paint's still wet. So while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and flip it over and do the guy on the other side. You know, something that I'm trying to do here when I'm doing this kind of detailed painting is I'm turning the miniature around. So my most comfortable range of motion for my hand is it's essentially moving up and down on with the last few digits of my fingers. So I will, whenever I'm trying to do detailed work, I will turn the miniature around so it is aligned with that motion, however I do it. Because it's a lot easier than me trying to like be really careful and going laterally or like any other direction in particular. This motion is very controlled for me, and it's going to kind of vary from person to person, but in particular, this is kind of the way that I go about it. So I've got this guy here. I've got a point of contact here with my pinky right here, and I've choked way up on the brush. I'm very, very close to the very end. So then I'm just going to go ahead and then just line in that line right there, just to kind of keep it nice and parallel with this top edge of this thing. This like little front plate on this guy. And notice that I'm going through and I'm actually painting in over the weathering that I did before, but that's fine. I'm going to go in and reapply that later. This is mostly just to illustrate the technique. If I were going to go through and do this from the start, that rusty weathering would be one of the last steps I'd probably do. I think that I would go through and add like the paint chips and a lot of other stuff before then. Okay, so looking at these two sides, that looks pretty symmetrical. Kind of bring it around to the front part here just to round it all out. So if you were going to pick out a miniature, what would you paint first? Where would you start?
Oh gosh.
What appeals to you?
Well, actually, it might be blasphemous, but I'm really excited about the idea of painting over some of my X-Wing minis.
Oh, nothing wrong with that.
I wanted to get like my own paint job on these guys.
That'd be cool.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be awesome. What faction do you like?
Scum.
Nice. Me too. Big fan.
I've had
They just
this,
have the most variety, right? You can kind of do whatever you want to with them. It's definitely very cool.
Yeah, I've got this Fang Fighter that's just been sitting on my desk, and it's like that's the one I want to do next. But
That's the guy?
I have to figure out the perfect one. It's a very special ship at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. So next little bit, I've got this kind of these markings shown here on either side. You can kind of see on that gray bit there. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to mix up a color that is very similar to the base coat color. There we go. Cool. And the first little bit, I'm going to go ahead and apply just a little bit of hand-painted chips in here. And it looks like it needs to be a little bit darker because I'm kind of picking up a little bit of a lighter color there. So you have to kind of go back and forth. This is a little challenging because I used colors out of spray cans that were not matched to acrylic paints that are already out. So if you had to do it over again, if you really want to try to leverage this chipping effect, you probably want to choose a base coat color that is pretty flat and easy to go back in and replicate. But I think in this case, just for the sake of expediency, I'm going to go ahead and kind of like bring up this gray a little bit lighter to be very similar to the color that I already had. And I'm just going to add like a few little marks and chips in this guy. That'll add a little bit of variety to the look. And you have to be kind of careful to not make it too symmetrical. That is always the challenge, to be very controlled. So I find that with the chipping effect, something that's really going to work out pretty well is to use a foam sponge to apply a lot of that, because you're going to get a lot more random effects on the guy. So again, I'm kind of turning this guy so I have the most control, and I'm going to go back in and I'm going to tidy up that edge a little bit.
I've just been resting my arm on the table the whole time. I should probably stop doing that.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah, you're not jostling it too much. That is something to watch out for while you're like hanging out with buddies at paint night. Is that I think the natural tendency is to like put your arms down on the table and kind of lock it in. But as soon as somebody kicks the table and you put a big nice streak across somebody's face, you're going to be you will quickly learn that it is not the best practice. I typically try to do a little tight like this, but if I'm painting by myself, it's more comfortable to like rest my arms on the table. Okay, so we got a couple little chip bits in there. Let me see if I have any foam here that I can use to illustrate this basic technique. Give me 1 second.
I do love the idea of someone just getting, like you said, like a magenta stripe across their face.
It's like war paint, right?
Yeah, they come home and they're like, oh my gosh, what happened to you?
What happened to you? All right, so this is just a chunk of foam that I just had from a extra tray from one of my figure cases. You can certainly go to any sort of like craft store and get like a bunch of like natural sponges that are often used for like faux finish painting on like houses or like craft projects. But this is just handy and accessible. I'm just going to go ahead and use this. So you want to use a color that is very dark and has like a good amount of contrast. So, and in this case, I am going to create that color by using a little bit of the Sith robes that we had before and a little bit of this brown, this Mimban mud that I've got right here to give me a nice deep brown. I'll go ahead and mix that up with my brush up here. A little bit of this, a little bit of this. Get a nice kind of deep dark brown. That's kind of what we want right there. And you want it to be pretty thick. You don't want it to be overly thin because transparency is not really what you want in this application. You want it to be nice and opaque. Okay, cool. So now we got this this little fella right here, which is our sponge, and I've kind of folded it over itself, so I have a corner there that is a little bit more controlled and smaller. So I'm going to dip that into this paint here, and then I'm going to kind of just do a couple of test dabs to kind of see how the marks are going. So as you do this, it'll also be very beneficial for you to change the direction of your hand so you're not stamping the same pattern across, as you go through and do it. And you really want to kind of focus on the most raised areas where it's really going to receive a lot of wear. So in this case, I'm going to go like here on the very edge of this part, some of this little chipping up on this part here. And I think it's nice when you have like kind of a bit of a gradual piece in the grouping of the marks, if that makes sense. So you have like it's almost like stippling with when working with traditional like 2D painting or anything, where you're just using a bunch of these little dots to kind of create the gradation from light to dark. But I want to kind of like concentrate here like really heavily, and then I just want to like lighten the pressure as I move further away from that. So it will kind of create a natural I guess gradient between the two colors and a kind of a smoother transition as you're going. So after I've kind of gone through and gotten some of these general marks down, I have a good indication of where all these things are going to be. It's up to you after that. If you really want to kind of like go into the overall kind of faux finish that you have going on, you can actually paint little highlights underneath each one of the chips. That is a little tedious and is usually reserved for very high-end painting. But I will show you like a little trick that you can do that makes that process a little bit easier if that's the overall effect that you want to try to achieve. So as opposed to going through and adding a chipping color of a dark color, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to choose this really light color because I have a lake of it right here that I can use. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to dab in that really light white over top of things. So I'm going to find an area here where that's going to show up pretty well. Let's say like down here on this lower portion. So I'm going to dab that in, and see I've got like that big kind of like chunky white bit right there, which doesn't look quite right yet. And you want to make sure to kind of get a little bit of the excess off because you want the paint to be pretty thin but still opaque as you go through.
Move that forward a little bit so people can see.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
A little tricky to get all these things lined up on the camera.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So we've got, you know, these big kind of massive chunky bits right here. So the next step is then to go back in with a fine detail brush and actually paint in over top of those bits, leaving a little sliver of that white underneath it. So that makes it a little bit more controlled in some regards, but it's still kind of a tedious process that you have to go through. So I'm just going to kind of start to go through and add each of these dark marks. I'm actually going to get an even more detailed brush for this. Little teeny tiny, what is this guy? A 000, so he is very small. Has a very nice fine point. And then I'm going to go back up here and get some of this dark kind of mixture that I had before. Let me find one of these chips here that I want to try to... Yeah, so this one is like nice and big and it's kind of ugly looking right now. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to go in and start to paint over top of that bit, leaving a little sliver of that white underneath each one.
So how many brushes would you recommend someone pick up if they're just starting the painting hobby?
If you're just starting, I think you can get by with 3. And I think that you want a fine detail brush like this, which is going to be usable for like a lot of the smaller stuff. And then you probably like a size 1 or a 2 after that, which is kind of akin to like one about this size, roughly. That's not a great example, but... and then you probably want one that's a little bit larger for washes and for base coats, which is usually going to be like a 2 or a 3. So okay. I think like a 00, a 1, and a 2 is pretty good. If you want to do dry brushing techniques, you want to get a large kind of flat. Mm-hmm. You can get from hobby stores or from art supply stores, kind of like wherever you want to go. Cool, so I'm going to kind of continue to go back through here and kind of tidy up this chipping effect here. And it's going to take a bit of time to achieve that, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So besides weathering and chipping, are there any other effects that you would recommend people try out at home?
Yeah, sure. There's you can do some cool stuff with mud by mixing in some gloss varnish. I unfortunately don't have the materials to illustrate that technique. Maybe there'll be a later one where you can use gloss varnish together with the paints to kind of suggest like a kind of wet, soggy ground, which can look very, very cool. You can mix in weathering powders. Weathering powders are essentially just like chalky pastel, kind of like pastels, I guess, that are usually affixed with a like a fixative of some sort. So you're going to apply it on there with kind of like a light brush, kind of dab it onto the areas and then kind of feather it out. I typically use paints because I feel like the weathering powders themselves are very subject to like surface abrasion, I guess. Like you can just kind of wipe them off unless you're really careful about how you do them. So I think there are certainly some good techniques. There are a lot of historical modelers that do really great stuff with weathering powders, but my preference is to achieve a lot of the weathering with just standard brush and with gradation and fades, kind of like as I've illustrated so far. Cool, so over on this side, we've got these kind of like light lines where we kind of chipped into this thing. I'm gonna go ahead and just paint a little line right over top of each one of those. It'll kind of suggest the same sort of effect. And this thing is not, this approach is not necessarily limited to just larger vehicles as well. I've kind of also achieved the same sort of look on this. Let me see if I can get him in focus there. Yeah, you can kind of see here on this Stormtrooper, I've gone through and added some little chips to his armor here and there, and I've kind of highlighted the underside of them to kind of add that kind of 3D effect on the miniature. And I think it looks really cool. It adds like a little grittiness to them, and I think that miniatures look a little bit more interesting with some battle damage on them. So I like to go through and apply those kind of effects as I go through. Yeah, so that's kind of like the general approach I would take to weathering a miniature. I think that you can go a lot of different routes with it. You can certainly be very meticulous with it and spend tons and tons of time, but I think you want to be kind of careful to not overdo it.
You got a framing?
Because you really want it to be kind of nice and gradual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, creating some nice like chipped up areas of the paint there. Looking pretty good. I like that. So one last little bit, just to kind of go through. I kind of touched on it earlier. We're kind of winding down right now, but I wanted to show a little bit about wet blending in particular. So that is when you have a paint on the brush and on the miniature, and you are applying your highlights and the lights and darks as the paint is still wet. So again, we got this Leica stuff down here that I'm going to use. I'm also going to add a little bit of white here as well for the highest highlights. I'm going to use this technique on Krennic because he's got a nice white cape, which will be nice and easy to illustrate. So first thing I'm going to do is just go through and apply a nice coat right here. And you don't want to, again, kind of like with the glue in the earlier step when I was doing the basing, you don't want to go too far because you don't want to let this dry as you're going. So then at this point, I'm just going to take a little bit of this white paint, and then while this paint is still wet, I'm going to go through and paint in a higher area here over top of each of these. And then I'm going to kind of feather it down a little bit. And then just for the sake of a little bit of contrast, I'm going to go through here with this kind of nice and dark color just to kind of show you. Here's a nice deep color there. And I'm just going to start to paint into these cracks and crevices as I go. And then while that paint is still wet, I'm just going to go through and just start to feather out those edges a little bit. And you're going to sometimes require a little bit of water on your brush, like a slightly damp brush, as you go. And then you're kind of just, you've set up these paints like kind of all close to one another. Some people do a very clean gradation from the light to the dark. Since I'm using colors that I already had out on my palette, I'm just kind of rolling with it right now. But yeah, so I'm just going to paint in this kind of darker color here. So you want to make sure that while you're doing this technique that you are still kind of keeping your paints nice and thin. So you're going to have to go back over these areas. And again, this is kind of why you want to work gradually as you go, because you don't want to let any of this paint dry while you're still like going through and smoothing out all the marks as you're going through and applying all this.
So how do you decide on a theme for your army?
A theme, okay. Well, a lot of times I will pick out the miniatures that I think are the coolest, and that's my starting point. So for me, the coolest thing in Star Wars is the Imperial Army, and in the Imperial Army, AT-STs and speeder bikes. So as far as the theme goes, I can automatically make some connections to Return of the Jedi and make an Endor themed force or something in particular. But I think what I'm actually going to be doing with my particular army is I am going to do the force that took over Kashyyyk, the subjugation force that was later stationed on Endor. I did kind of research about this, you can tell. Mm-hmm. So I can then, because I'm going to do a Kashyyyk-themed table here pretty soon. So yeah, I think that you kind of want to look at what you have going on, features that you really like in particular. I'm going to go ahead and add, just to kind of show this wet on wet here with a little bit of this brown on the bottom, and just kind of feather it out as I go. So yeah, I think that you want to kind of pick and choose the miniatures that you like the most and kind of lean into the theme that way. And sometimes the theme is not really like based on a location, it's based on you know, like a tactical choice, like a scouting force or a you know, like a heavy artillery company or something. You know, like there's lots of world military themes and tropes that you can kind of leverage if you really want to go into it. So again, I've kind of like added a little bit of this color here. I'm just then going in and just feathering out those edges. And it's going to take a little bit of time to get it the perfect blend that you really want. But the big thing here is that I'm working with the paint while it's wet, and if you get into a good rhythm with it, you can get this work done relatively quickly with a little bit of practice. And it's especially useful on cloaks and capes, I find. Cool. All right, how are we doing on time?
About 4 minutes.
Okay.
Yep. So we've got about 5 minutes left,
Yeah, any
and
other
we do have a couple more questions in Twitch.
Yeah, I'm ready for it.
Let's see here. Someone asked if you have any tips for painting specifically the snow speeder.
The snow speeder, okay. Well, I think with the snow speeder, you want to start off with a light hull color. I think that you want to apply the same sort of zenithal technique that I mentioned before, where you're going to, if you want it to be really rusty, that is, you can start off with a kind of a rusty brown underneath it as you go through. But you want to start off with a fairly light color. I think that that particular miniature has a lot of large flat areas on it, which are not going to take just a standard wash very well, because the wash is going to kind of pool on the raised areas. So I think you want to be a little selective, and you want to kind of trace in with your shadows along the armor panels as you go through. If you have access to an airbrush, that makes the whole process quite a bit easier to get like nice variations in color and tone as you go. But if you're using a brush, I think a nice flat base coat, if you can try to find like a good rattle can to get your initial base coat down, and then like a large brush with like some thin down paint to kind of get your initial base coat on there, and then go back in and kind of carefully trace in all the shadows. I think it will definitely help out quite a bit. And a lot of that is just dependent on what colors you want to use, you know. But I think typically you see those air speeders in kind of like an off-white beige color with like a nice accent stripe across it too.
Cool. And then just really, really quick, any advice on doing blaster bolt damage?
Blaster bolt damage, yeah. So I think with blaster bolts, you want to, let me see if I have a good thing I can kind of illustrate this on. So let's say that this fellow right here has got a blaster bolt on him. And I'll go over this thing later, but this is mostly just to kind of illustrate the overall effect. So blaster bolts are going to look really good if they have like a nice kind of feathered out effect on them. So if I'm going to put like a little bit here, and then, you know, I'm going to kind of streak it out a little bit. You know, you want to be kind of irregular in how you do it. So I'm going to kind of like make the initial mark here, and you can kind of see where it's wet. And then I'm going to use a little bit more intense color here in the center of it. So you want to start off with just kind of like a thin, kind of dithered edge to whatever you're doing. And you can sometimes achieve that with a nice soft bristled brush and a light dry brush as well. Let me see if I've got a great, here we go. This is a good one. So if you've got a dry brush that is like nice and ratty, like this fella right here. So after you've loaded up your brush and you have a fair amount of it, fair amount of the paint off, you can also kind of like go through and just do a light kind of circular motion here to kind of suggest the area around that blaster bolt. You kind of build up where it's going to go. Again, I would always suggest like using like a gray first, and you want to kind of feather out those edges as much as you can. And then as you move towards the center, you want to start to make that more and more opaque with more and more kind of careful blast marks.
And if you are a fan of this kind of content and you would potentially like to see more detail on blaster damage on minis, please leave a comment on the video and let us know. Yeah, hopefully then we'll be able to bring you more stuff like this.
Yeah, totally. I'd be curious to hear what people want to learn about next. I think there's a lot of different stuff I could cover. Airbrushing and green stuff and a wide variety of different things that you can kind of go with. But I think that was a good start. I certainly enjoyed myself sitting down. Thanks for letting me kind of paint some of my own miniatures for an hour or so. It's pretty great.
Yes, well, I think that these effects look amazing and ready for battle. So, John, thank you so much for being here.
Sure.
And thank you to everyone at home for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to turn on notifications. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all of our social media. Links in the doobly-doo. And be sure to come back on Thursday when we'll be talking about the inheritance cycle for Legend of the Five Rings, the card game, with Tyler Parrott. Also, this weekend, we will be streaming the Star Wars Legion World Championship on Saturday and Sunday beginning at 10 a.m. It promises to be a very exciting weekend, so make sure you are tuned in to catch all the action. That's it for news from me. Thanks again for joining us. Bye!
See ya.